Hey, does anybody want to join?
The main aim of the session is looking around the coach-athlete relationship and essentially how a coach can use different forms of kind of social power or essentially improve the coach-athlete relationship and the athlete's learning. I hope that the concepts that we discussed tonight will get you ultimately to think about how you interact with athletes and actually kind of how, say, you present yourself to athletes can have implications for your relationships with them. And it might get you to also think about stuff that's not necessarily talked about in this session, but wider concepts. So just to try and talk about the importance of social interaction. So what we'll do is, to start off with, we'll just kind of have a brief setting the scene about what coaching is a social practice and kind of why we as researchers argue that it's important. Then we'll get on to talking about kind of trust and respect in the coach-athlete relationship and why it's imperative to kind of try to, I suppose, obtain and maintain athletes' trust and respect. And then the main bulk of the session will be kind of exploring different ways that you guys can potentially try to obtain and maintain those social relationships with your athletes. So by using different forms of power. And what we'll do here is we'll have a look at some social concepts or social theory to try to interpret that and use that to inform how we may go about kind of our coaching practice. And then we'll just get on to suggested readings and some discussion and questions at the end. Okay. So in your small groups, I just want you just to brainstorm on your pieces of paper some characteristics of a good coach. Okay. So what do you think a good coach needs to be or needs to do in order to be a good coach? Okay.
Hey, does anybody want to join?
Everything always seems to come back towards interaction between you and, say, those key contextual stakeholders. So you and your athletes, you and parents, you and other coaches. Okay. Now, for me, I would argue, or there's a body of research that has argued that coaching is ultimately this social endeavour which is based around human interaction. Okay. If you think about everything that we've identified here, the underpinning feature is how you actually interact and communicate with your athletes. So yes, I know we've said being a good listener, you could argue more maybe, well, that's not necessarily communication, but I would still argue it's a form of interaction. Okay, and that's an underpinning feature. Now, where this is kind of, this line of thinking has stemmed from is that a lot of kind of traditional research within coaching, and for me it's underpinned a lot of coach education workshops, is that we have this line of thinking that there is this best coaching practice out there, that there's this holy grail, and if you do 1 + 1, you will get 2. Now, I don't want to say that that's wrong, and that kind of body of work and those coach education sessions haven't helped people, because they have, and they've developed coaches and they've developed the talent of coaches in the country. But what I would say is that it kind of fails to recognise that we coach within this kind of social world, and that there is this social and cultural kind of aspect of coaching that impacts upon the outcomes that we have. So what we found is that a lot of the stuff that in terms of this is that it's kind of been criticised for being fine in theory, but then when we've gone to try to apply that in our own coaching context, it maybe hasn't necessarily worked. And now we would argue that's because, well, say if I go and work and coach in a context, and then Sean goes and coaches in exactly the same way in a different context, it doesn't mean it's going to work, because the people who he interacts with and the way he interacts with athletes, parents, whoever it is, will be different. That cultural context will be different, and we need to give consideration to, well, how do we actually interact with these athletes, and give thought to those social and cultural aspects. So it's okay saying, well, Alex Ferguson coaching this way at Man United, the greatest coach ever, I'm going to do what he does. It doesn't mean it'll necessarily work, because every situation is different. So kind of what there's been a turn towards is trying to have a look at, in terms of research perspective anyway, over the last kind of 10 years, trying to understand the unique, I suppose, peculiarities of each coaching context and the different types of social issues that each coach will face. And then let's talk about these issues. And then when we talk about them, let's reflect upon them and then think about them in my own coaching context. Now, this is not to say that the things that Sean would recommend in his coaching context would definitely work in your coaching context, because that goes against the principles of everything being different. But the idea is being that, well, Sean discusses his ideas, I can reflect upon those ideas in relation to my own coaching practice and think, actually, maybe I could try that and apply that, and then if that works, that's great. If it might not work though, okay? So that's kind of what we've argued, and like I said, there's been so much research done in the last kind of 10 years about this social nature. And in terms of kind of today, the kind of aim is to introduce you to these sociological aspects. Now, like I keep banging on about, the general underlying consensus is that good coaches can ultimately evaluate and reflect upon what they do as coaches, so they can give consideration to how and why they do things. Now, obviously, in relation to that, I want you to try and think about your coaching practice, and I also want you to think about the social nature of coaching, because I think it's important for you to give consideration to those aspects. And building upon that what you'll find is a lot of the stuff that we talk about today, you'll be like, actually, I do most of this. But you'll often do it like implicitly rather than explicitly. And if you don't actually give consideration or critically think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, then I would argue that you can't actually develop programs and coaching sessions that can maximize your athlete's potential. And also, you don't really give consideration for the implications of your practice. Well, how is what you're doing impacting upon your athletes or the other individuals within your environment? At the end of the session, can you try to answer these questions? So, do you understand why you act in the ways you do and coach in certain ways? Why do you believe in these values and ideas and reject others? Can you explore ideas with which you don't normally conform to? Are you able to see situations from other people's points of view? Are my coaching methods congruent with my principles? And can I devise and implement alternative pedagogies or practices that may be more educative? Okay, so just try to remember those questions. Small group task, okay? So 5 minutes said with a partner again. I want you to just discuss if you think obtaining, maintaining, and advancing the trust and respect of your athletes is a key ingredient of your coaching practice, okay? And then if you do, can you say why you think it's important? Or if you don't think it's important, why do you not think it's important, okay? So just 5 minutes to discuss that in your groups.
Hey, does anybody want to join?
If you don't have their trust and respect, I don't feel that they will necessarily be receptive to your coaching strategies or buy into your methods, which can obviously have implications in terms of you as a coach, especially if you're working in those talent settings. If we think about, if you go into as an elite coach and you go into an environment and you don't command their trust and respect, and they're like, actually, well, I'm not going to do what you ask. A bit like, say, Jose Mourinho at Chelsea last season, then things can obviously go pear-shaped pretty quickly. And then the other side of that is that the athletes, if they don't trust what you're saying to them and don't believe in that, actually, well, this is a good coach and he can help me to get better, then they probably won't learn as much as they perhaps can. And then the other side of that is that will then potentially negatively impact upon competitive performance on a Saturday or a Sunday or whenever it is. And then the other good point that we talked about, obviously, from like those safety perspectives as well. So we talked about in gymnastics that obviously if you're the coach and you're trying to show them new moves and stuff like that, that if the athlete doesn't trust the coach, then perhaps they're not going to be, say, willing to trust them in terms of, I don't know, say learning to do a somersault and stuff like that, which could have implications in terms of injury and all those types of things. But yeah, so I'm really pleased that you feel it's important, because if you didn't, the rest of the session might have been a bit tough. What I've done now throughout the rest of the PowerPoint is taken some quotes from kind of elite coaches and elite athletes. Now, I'll just give you a second to read this quote. There's a couple of them, so I'll just give you a second to read them and digest and reflect upon them. So these next two are from the player's perspective. So it just flips it on its head a little bit. And that trust and respect is an important feature, but Sean and your group have come on to some important points. Well, if it is important, how exactly do we obtain it? How do we maintain it, and how do we advance that relationship? Because that is probably perhaps the most difficult thing, especially in terms of maintaining it, advancing it. I quite like your idea of that it's a tug and war relationship between you and the athletes, and you're constantly trying to promote and gain that trust and respect of your athlete, and that's very much dependent upon the things that you guys do as coaches. Okay, so what we're going to do now is that we're going to have a look at a French and Raven's basis of social power. Okay, so this was originally developed in 1959 and then further refined by Raven in 1992. It suggests that, or it's been agreed that power is this kind of omnipresent feature of social life. So when we interact with others, we are inevitably kind of trying to impose power on those relationships. Okay, so it's kind of again a bit tug and war, but basically we're just trying to get others to essentially do what we want them to do. Okay, now they then define, using that kind of concept, they develop this framework which basically says that individuals can try to use 6 different sources of power to try to kind of almost get others to buy into what they want them to do, or in the case of coaching, to try to obtain, maintain and advance your social relationships or the trust and respect of your athletes. Okay. Now these are legitimate, expert, informational, referent, reward and coercive power. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at these different forms of power in turn. We're going to discuss what they mean, how they could obviously be applied to coaching, and then we're going to discuss the potential benefits and limitations of using these different types of approaches in your coaching. So the first one is legitimate power, okay? Now, or positional power. And I suppose the idea with legitimate power is that it evolves solely around of just saying essentially, well, I am the coach, so you guys should respect me. Essentially, it's just it's a power of the position. So if for example if David Cameron walked into the room, probably not a great choice, but it was the first name that comes to my head. But if he come into the room, he would probably instantly command a little bit of respect from you guys, and that's because of his position of authority. Or say if you're at work, the first time that you have a meeting with your boss, they probably automatically command your respect, okay? And this is what legitimate power is. So from your coaching point of view, you turn up to your first session with your athletes, right? I probably automatically have your respect because I'm the coach, and after all, I'm here to make you better, so you should listen to what I have to say, okay? Now, what do we think about that source of power?
Hey, does anybody want to join?
Everyone will have a certain amount of legitimate power or respect when you first enter the environment, but that respect will erode or enhance depending upon what you do next. And again, coming back to that social context, like you said, whereas in Spain, that you might be able to rely on that legitimate power for a bit longer, or in different kind of environments. So it might be different between rugby and football, but ultimately, that it would seem that it's kind of, well, it's all right to start off with, but just trying to rely on that form of power, or I am the coach, so you need to listen to me and respect me, will only last for so long, and it's very much dependent upon, well, what do you do next? And what you do next will impact upon that legitimate power. So for example, if we kept with the David Cameron thing, or theme, if David Cameron come in, and then he spoke to you guys, and he delivered a really nice speech, and you interacted with him. He was like, oh, I really like David Cameron. All of a sudden, your trust and respect for him, or his legitimate power over you guys, is going to increase. So the next time he comes in, you're like, oh, I've got loads of respect. I've got loads of time for him. But then if in that second time he comes in and he says stuff that you don't agree with, and he doesn't interact with you in the way that you want him to, it will start to go down, and then that legitimate power that he holds over you will reduce. One way that coaches can try to enhance their legitimate power, or say if we're saying during the coaching session, is through the demonstration of expert power, okay? So basically, expert power defined officially is that this individual, or power over someone, or respect that they earn because they have a special amount of knowledge, or they possess a special set of skills that other people kind of like have respect for ultimately, okay? Now key thing for me is that it's all about athletes' perceptions. So it might be that you don't necessarily have a load of expertise or expert power, but it comes down to that athlete's perceptions. If they think that you're, say, really knowledgeable and you have this expertise, they essentially will buy into this idea that you're the expert. They'll trust and respect you more, and they're more likely to do what you say. Now, it could be that you have the best knowledge in the world, but if they don't believe that, you won't enhance your legitimate power or the amount of respect that they have for you through the use of expert power, okay? So another small group task. So if you're thinking about coaching in your coaching environment, what things do you think you could do in that environment that may enhance or erode the amount of expert power you have over your athletes?
Hey, does anybody want to join?
That record of success. So if you're working with that new body of athletes, if you go in there, we just talked about the example, say if you was like, oh, I'm a golf coach and I used to coach Tiger Woods when he was winning his majors, started coaching Rory McIlroy, that would command respect. And then it's a great thing, that record of success, that expertise at the start, and yeah, if you can tell them, well, last season I've done this, or like you said in terms of that, when I took over this team, they were not doing very well, and then when I finished with them, they were doing really well. It just breeds that respect into you, and then they're more likely to be receptive to your coaching methods. Okay, so that's a good one. Can we, and it's something perhaps we've not really discussed yet, can you engage in those discussions with your athletes? So say if you was talking about, I'll say football or rugby or any sport really, can you showcase in an engagement with your athletes that you have the technical and the tactical knowledge to underpin what you're doing? Because I would argue that if you went into a changing room for England and you couldn't talk about, say, the various different formations and the various different tactics that you're going to be using and why you're going to be using them, that the athletes might not buy into that. So I would definitely say you need to have that subject knowledge which we talked about previously. So these are some quotes in action. So I'll let you have a read through them, and then we'll just have a little discussion about them afterwards. A lot of them are kind of the concepts and the ideas that we've previously discussed. Now, it would seem obviously that expert power is like a great form of power or source of power, but there is ultimately implications with using this form of power, especially in isolation. Okay, now there's been kind of obviously research into this area, and that it would suggest that it's not just demonstrating that expert power. So say for example, if you was giving an explanation or you was giving a demonstration, but it's also how you communicate that source of power to the athletes. And while you may have the greatest knowledge in the world, if you don't communicate it in appropriate ways and the athletes can't actually take it in and appreciate it, then it might not have the positive effect. So in terms of this research a while ago now, okay, it's kind of suggested that like advice given in a purely authoritarian manner for prolonged periods of time might not have great implications for kind of the coach-athlete relationship and trying to demonstrate your expert power in positive ways. So the overall kind of consensus is that yes, you do need to have this knowledge, but it's how you communicate this knowledge as well. So it's not just, you can't just use this power source in isolation. It's taking it to the next phase, which neatly ties in with the next power type, which is informational power. Okay, so basically, informational power, another word that you can use to describe it is persuasion. Okay, so and it's basically just kind of saying, right, well, it's the quality of the information that you provide or the strength of the argument that you provide to your athletes. Okay, so it's not just telling them kind of, I suppose, what to do. It's telling them why you want them to do it and what the benefits of that will be in terms of them as being an athlete. So best way to look at it for me is that if you as an athlete receiving this information, someone who uses informational power in a good way, the athlete will be able to say, actually, I can clearly see what the coach is saying. I can clearly see how that relates to me and how I will benefit from doing that. So I'm definitely going to do what he's saying. Okay. In terms of the power types, like all the research with the elite coaches has been, this is a really important form of power, because ultimately it gets to buy them in, because they should be able to listen to what you're saying and be like, actually, he knows what he's talking about, and I can clearly see how that can relate to me and my performance. Okay, so here's a nice good quote of him in action. And in terms of overall advice, in terms of giving that reason, I would very much say that if you can put that why across in terms of the benefits for them and the link between this training practice and, say, the competitive performance, it will go a long way to getting getting the buy-in, because if they can clearly see, well, this is going to help me go from here to, say, in archery, getting to the Olympics and winning a gold or winning the next event on the weekend, then they'll be more likely to buy into what you want them to do. But it comes back to that, like making it accessible to those individuals. So if it works that you have to put it across in a way that relates to Finding Nemo, then it's doing it in that way. If I think about when I used to coach younger age groups, that if you wanted to get them to kind of spend time with the ball and doing various different techniques, it'll obviously be right, well, we're going to play like Finding Nemo games, or we're going to play like Pirates of the Caribbean. Right, I want you to scrub the deck, which basically means I'm getting you to do toe taps on the football. But they don't really necessarily need to know kind of, well, why they're doing it at this point. That it's like, well, this is fun, and it's promoting it that way. Whereas if you was with an elite group of athletes and you put that across, it's probably not going to go down too well. Yeah. And again, but like some of them might do, and it comes back to that social relationship and interaction, knowing your athletes, and like you said, that athlete perception of it. If they perceive that it is good, and like you talked about a little bit, that it's an act, isn't it? Discuss the ways that you've tried to kind of use incentives or rewards in your coaching practices, and whether they were or were not successful. Okay, so you maybe think about, say, different types of rewards that you've used, or different ways that you try to incentivize your athletes. Okay, were they successful or not? And then also talk about kind of scold as well. So exactly the same. How have you used scold, and what impact have they had on the coach-athlete relationship, and if they were successful?
Hey, does anybody want to join?
Generally speaking, I would say that probably praise is more constructive than scold, but it's knowing like how much, how often, and of which type of reward. If you like, say, identifying one person in a group, it can, if you're not careful, it can have quite profound negative effects on that one individual, especially if you just kind of publicly berate them in front of others, especially if it's a repeated basis. It's potentially not the most motivating factor in the world, but yeah, so really good. So obviously good discussion, and it's good to highlight that there's various different ways or different strategies that we can use, whether it's praise or scold, and something obviously the key thing for me to consider is that typically research would suggest people obviously prefer praise and scold, and I would say that most people do, as in, if you think about your own thing, it's nicer to be praised than it is to be scolded all the time. But it's about knowing how much of each reward, how often, what type of reward for the athlete, and it just comes back to that athlete's perceptions, and you guys trying to understand and know your athletes and know what implications this reward has for one athlete, and it won't be the same for every athlete, and it won't be the same for every group of athletes that you work in, and this is where this how-to coaching module for me doesn't work, because I can't turn around to you and say, you just go and you say 10 lots of well dones in a session and you're going to have positive effects. We don't know that. It's very much obviously that trial and error. In terms of scold, a lot of the elite coaches were talked about kind of in terms of poor performance and kind of issues around, say, maybe their conduct and stuff like that. It's trying to put that scold across within a supportive way, rather than literally just berating those individuals. So whether that is a supportive way on an individual and a private basis, or whether it's, say, even using some video and performance analysis to help support your argument and get the buy-in that way. So if you think about linking back to that expert power and that informational power, if you're talking about, well, you didn't play very well on Saturday, and rather than me just shouting at you, I'm going to bring up some clips on the iPad to show you what didn't go so well and what we need to do to improve, rather than literally just being like, you were rubbish. So yeah, so very good. So the last one is referent power. Okay. Now this is more kind of about you as an individual rather than, say, you as a coach. So it's them liking you as a person, rather than maybe, say, just your coaching expertise. So it's the official definition is that it's that identification with the person and their desire to be like you as a person. Okay. So kind of, if we look at like Graham Taylor, okay, so if we look at his quote there, you're actually showing them that you care, and whilst you show that you think about them and the other side of life, you stand to gain a great deal in terms of your working relationship with them. So it's kind of showing you care about them as individuals, and they will kind of like you, essentially. So they like you as a person, don't just respect you as a coach, okay? So a little group task, only a couple of minutes. How do you think that you could actually try to develop and maintain this power base? So what different strategies could you use to ensure that, say, or try to build the athlete's likeness for you, or an actual relationship based upon kind of almost being friends rather than just respect as a coach?
Hey, does anybody want to join?
So if you was an athlete, and I think back to the times when I was an athlete, if the coach come up and was like, oh, you had your maths exam at school last week, like how did you get on? How did it go? Have you been revising? Or if he come in and you ask the mum that, like, oh, how did he get on his maths exam? He's got an A, and then you like see him at the session and you give him a pat on the back and you're like, this is fantastic, and show him some praise towards those type of things. So I would definitely suggest, like, in terms of their wider social lives, and say maybe remembering birthdays and all those different things, it can show a way that they can start to like you. And then the other side of that, being a bit more potentially not manipulative but micro-political, is that if you kind of get on well with their parents, it might have positive effects in terms of the athlete as well. So if the parents trust you and respect you, they're inevitably going to have conversations with their son or their daughter, and that might have positive implications. Whereas if you and the parents don't get on so well and you disagree, they might undermine you as a coach at home over the dinner table. And then the coach comes to the session, or the athlete comes to the session, well, I'm not sure I should be buying into what the coach says because Dad has kind of suggested coach doesn't know what he's talking about. And then again, this links back to the other say forms of power as well, that if you know these things, that can impact upon how you interact with the athlete at that period of time in the coaching environment. So if you know that they're stressed with exams, then maybe in terms of they do something wrong in the session, you go easier on the scold, or you give them a bit more praise to build them up rather than knocking them down, because they might not be able to deal with that because of other things that are going on in their lives. And it's important to remember that while we see them as athletes, they're not athletes. They're human beings. Then another good one for me really is like humour as well, in terms of that coaching environment, and being approachable. And obviously it's not saying that like laughing all the time with your athletes, but being able to kind of have, I suppose, a bit of banter with them and a little bit of a laugh and a joke, and showing that you have a human side as well as this coaching side can go a long way to those liking or the liking for the coach. That if I reflect back on, say, my experience as an athlete, the coaches that I liked the most were always ones that I was excited to go and have a chat to at the coaching sessions, the ones that showed those interests in my wider social lives, the one that would have a little bit of a laugh and a joke with me. And then I commanded so much more respect for them because of those aspects. Briefly recapping, like obviously we talked about how like trust and respect is a really important aspect of that kind of coach-athlete relationship, and obviously the interaction is at the heart of it, and that I would say that you stand to gain a great deal if you can obtain, maintain and develop the trust and respect that your athletes have for you. And then the best ways to try to do that is obviously knowing your individual athletes and understanding them, and knowing that they won't all be the same, and that you may have to act in different ways with different athletes. Yeah, so in terms of the take-home message of taking the quote from Raven himself, who developed the basis of social power. So obviously I'll let you guys read it, but hopefully through the session you'll start to think about these things, and just think that one, that obviously that power is just this omnipresent feature of life, and that everyone will demonstrate kind of power, and that yes, that we kind of, to know their effectiveness or how to demonstrate power effectively, we have to think about the different ways we can demonstrate that power and the potential benefits of that, and importantly the side effects of it. So yeah, so in terms of suggested readings, I've put two different books on. So they're both very similar in terms of the concepts that we've talked about, in terms that they apply social theory to coaching practice, and it's all about getting you to have a look at how social theory could be integrated into practice, and then getting you to reflect upon the stories that are presented and relating them to your own coaching practices.
Hey, does anybody want to join?